While folk legend Arlo Guthrie raised his children in the spotlight of musical royalty, his four offspring faced shocking personal battles that would have broken lesser spirits. From scandalous divorces and provocative performances that horrified audiences to devastating loss and reinvention in honky-tonk bars, the Guthrie children's stories reveal heartbreak, rebellion, and surprising resilience behind their famous surname. Here's what really happened to Arlo Guthrie's children. Abe Guthrie. Abe Guthrie became the musical foundation that allowed his father Arlo's career to flourish for nearly 4 decades. But his journey to that role was anything but conventional for a child born into America's most famous folk music dynasty. As the eldest of Arlo's 4 children, Abe showed an early rebellious streak that would define his relationship with music and eventually lead him to become an indispensable part of his father's touring operation. The signs of Abe's musical destiny appeared when he was just 3 years old, though not in the way anyone expected. In what would become family legend, the toddler traded his big-wheel bicycle to a neighborhood boy in exchange for a keyboard, showing an instinctive understanding that music would be more important to his future than playground toys. This early bargaining skill would serve him well in the music industry. But first, he had to navigate the challenges of growing up as a Guthrie. By age 11, Abe's musical interests had already diverged dramatically from the folk traditions that made his grandfather Woody famous and kept his father Arlo in the spotlight. When his piano teacher discovered that young Abe was more interested in playing rock music than classical pieces, the lessons came to an abrupt end. He was kicked out for refusing to conform to traditional musical education, a decision that his family supported, even though it meant he would largely teach himself how to play. This self-directed musical education paid off when Abe landed his first paying job at just 15 years old, working as a guitar technician for David Bromberg, a respected folk and blues musician who often collaborated with his father. The job gave Abe behind-the-scenes access to professional music making and taught him the technical skills that would later make him invaluable as both a performer and producer. In the early 1980s, Abe shocked the folk music community by embracing the era's most rebellious musical trends. He formed a rock band called Xavier and began performing in a style that was completely at odds with the Guthrie family's gentle, socially conscious image. During Xavier's performances, Abe would appear on stage wearing spikes and chains, adopting the aggressive aesthetic of punk and heavy metal that was considered shocking even by the standards of a family known for challenging social conventions. The contrast was striking. While Arlo continued to perform thoughtful folk songs about social justice and personal reflection, his eldest son was experimenting with loud, aggressive rock music while dressed like a member of a motorcycle gang. For most families, this might have caused serious tension. But the Guthries had always encouraged artistic expression, even when it pushed boundaries. Despite his rock star appearance, Abe never abandoned his connection to his father's music. By the mid-1980s, he had become a regular member of Arlo's touring band, bringing his keyboard skills and rock sensibilities to folk performances. His ability to play bass lines with his left hand while handling melody and harmony with his right made him essentially a one-man rhythm section, allowing Arlo to perform with a smaller, more economical touring group. Xavier continued as a side project for Abe throughout the 1990s, with Arlo even taking the band on tour as his opening act for 5 years, starting in 1991. The arrangement showed how the family had learned to blend their different musical approaches rather than let them create division. Xavier finally released their full-length album, Full Circle, in 2000 on Arlo's own Rising Sun Records label, giving Abe's rock ambitions a proper outlet while keeping the project within the family business. Today, Abe remains rarely seen without his father on stage, having spent more than 36 years as Arlo's most trusted musical collaborator. His transformation from a spike-wearing rock rebel to the steady backbone of American folk music represents one of the more surprising career evolutions in the Guthrie family story. Annie Guthrie. Annie Guthrie took the most unconventional and emotionally challenging path to music among all of Arlo's children, earning herself the family nickname of the dark and brooding Guthrie, as she struggled for years to find her artistic voice while battling severe performance anxiety. Unlike her siblings, who seemed to naturally gravitate toward performing, Annie spent decades working behind the scenes before finally stepping into the spotlight, making her musical debut feel like both a personal victory and a long-overdue revelation. As the middle daughter in a family where music was not just a career but a way of life, Annie faced the unique challenge of growing up surrounded by legendary performers while feeling uncertain about her own place in that world. Her grandfather, Woody Guthrie, had defined American folk music. Her father, Arlo, had become a counterculture icon, and her siblings were already making their marks as musicians, leaving Annie to wonder where she fit into the family legacy. Rather than force herself onto the stage before she was ready, Annie found her initial role in the family business by becoming Arlo's tour manager, a position that allowed her to stay close to the music while avoiding the spotlight that made her uncomfortable. For years, she handled the complex logistics of keeping a touring folk musician's career running smoothly, managing everything from travel arrangements to venue coordination while watching her father and siblings perform night after night from the side of the stage. During this period, Annie was quietly developing her own musical tastes and songwriting skills, though few people outside the family knew about her creative work. When she finally began discussing her influences publicly, she surprised many folk music fans by revealing that her musical inspiration came from sources far beyond the traditional folk and protest songs that had made her family famous. While she certainly drew from the rich traditions established by her grandfather Woody Guthrie and learned from watching her father Arlo perform, she also admitted to being heavily influenced by mainstream 1980s acts that seemed completely at odds with the Guthrie family's image. Among her most surprising musical influences were Mötley Crüe, the notorious heavy metal band known for their wild lifestyle and aggressive sound, and Men Without Hats, the Canadian new wave group best known for their hit song about dancing safely. These choices revealed that Annie's musical palette was far more diverse and contemporary than anyone might have expected from a member of America's first family of folk music. The contrast between her family's acoustic, socially conscious folk traditions and her personal attraction to synthesizer-heavy 80s rock showed how Annie was determined to create her own artistic identity rather than simply follow the established Guthrie path. This internal struggle between honoring her heritage and expressing her individual creativity contributed to the performance anxiety that kept her away from the stage for so many years. Annie's musical coming out finally happened in 2016 when she released her debut album Dragonfly, a deeply personal collection of songs that showcased both her songwriting abilities and her willingness to blend different musical styles. The album revealed an artist who had spent years carefully crafting her sound, combining the storytelling traditions of her family with the emotional intensity and production techniques she had absorbed from her 80s rock influences. The release of Dragonfly marked the end of Annie's decades-long struggle with performance anxiety and established her as a legitimate artist in her own right, proving that sometimes the longest path to success can also be the most rewarding. Sarah Lee Guthrie. Sarah Lee Guthrie experienced the most dramatic personal and professional upheaval of any of Arlo's children when her 15-year marriage and musical partnership with Johnny Irion ended in 2014, forcing her to rebuild both her personal life and her entire artistic identity from the ground up. As the youngest of Arlo's 4 children, Sarah Lee had built her adult life around a creative collaboration that seemed destined to carry the Guthrie musical legacy into the next generation, making the collapse of that partnership all the more devastating when it finally occurred. The partnership between Sarah Lee and Johnny had begun as a classic folk music love story when they married in October 1999, and started performing together as an acoustic duo in late 2000. Their musical collaboration combined Johnny's love of rock and blues with Sarah Lee's deep roots in folk and country music, creating a sound that honored the Guthrie family traditions while pushing into new territory. For more than a decade, they toured extensively, both as a duo and as part of Arlo's family concerts, released multiple albums together, and even recorded a children's album that featured contributions from folk legends like Pete Seeger. What made their separation particularly difficult was how intertwined their personal and professional lives had become. They had performed at prestigious venues like the Newport Folk Festival and Carnegie Hall, collaborated with respected producers, including Wilco's Jeff Tweedy, and built a reputation as one of folk music's most promising young couples. Sarah Lee had essentially grown up as an artist within this partnership, making it impossible to separate her musical identity from her relationship with Johnny. When their marriage ended in the mid-2010s, Sarah Lee found herself facing a crisis that went far beyond the typical challenges of divorce. She had to figure out not just how to live as a single person again, but how to perform and create music without the partner who had been central to her artistic development for her entire adult life. The breakup was handled with discretion, and Sarah Lee did not publicly acknowledge the divorce until 2023, nearly a decade after it occurred. Rather than stay in familiar surroundings where everything reminded her of her former life, Sarah Lee made the bold decision to relocate to Austin, Texas, a city known for its vibrant and diverse music scene. This geographical change became the catalyst for a complete artistic reinvention that surprised everyone who knew her work. Instead of continuing in the folk and acoustic traditions that had defined both her family heritage and her previous collaborations, Sarah Lee began exploring honky-tonk and country music in Austin's dive bars and smaller venues. This transformation represented a dramatic departure from everything that had previously defined her career. She went from performing carefully crafted folk songs in theaters and concert halls to playing background music for dancers, doing the Austin two-step in rowdy bars. Rather than being the intense focus of seated, attentive audiences, she became part of the ambient atmosphere in venues where people came primarily to drink and socialize. Sarah Lee described this period as starting over and trying to figure out how to do it all over again, acknowledging how disorienting it was to rebuild her entire approach to music and performance. The experience taught her to take her craft less seriously, while simultaneously helping her discover new aspects of her artistic personality that had been dormant during her years as part of a folk music duo. Kathy Guthrie. Kathy Guthrie created perhaps the most shocking departure from her family's wholesome folk music image when she teamed up with Willie Nelson's daughter Amy to form Folk Uke, a deceptively sweet-sounding duo that performs some of the most explicit and provocative songs in American music. What started as a friendship between two daughters of music legends evolved into a musical project that regularly leaves audiences stunned by the contrast between the performers' gentle harmonies and their outrageously inappropriate lyrics. Kathy initially described herself as the musical holdout among her siblings, reluctant to follow the family tradition of becoming a performer, despite growing up surrounded by some of America's most respected folk musicians. Her path to music began in the late 1990s when she was working at Croce's in Cephon, a restaurant and bar in San Diego owned by Ingrid Croce, the widow of singer-songwriter Jim Croce. It was there that she met Amy Nelson, and the two bonded over their shared experience of being the daughters of famous musicians and their mutual struggles with performance anxiety. The formation of Folk Uke happened almost by accident, as both women discovered that humor helped them overcome their stage fright and social anxieties about living up to their family legacies. What began as a way to cope with the pressure of being famous daughters evolved into a full-fledged musical act that deliberately shocked audiences by combining sweet, innocent-sounding melodies with lyrics that pushed every boundary of good taste and social acceptability. Their repertoire includes songs with titles that cannot be fully stated in most public forums, dealing with topics ranging from domestic relationships to bodily functions, all delivered with the kind of gentle harmonies and acoustic instrumentation that audiences associate with traditional folk music. The deliberate contrast between their musical presentation and their lyrical content became folk uke's signature approach, creating a form of musical comedy that was both deeply offensive and oddly endearing. The most infamous example of how their act could shock unsuspecting audiences occurred at Willie Nelson's 4th of July picnic in 2011 at Billy Bob's Texas in Fort Worth. Scheduled to perform at 11:30 in the morning, Folk Uke took the stage and immediately launched into one of their most explicit songs, creating a scene that became legendary in country music circles. Families who had brought their children to see Willie Nelson were completely unprepared for the profanity and sexual content that poured out of the two sweet-looking women with acoustic instruments. The reaction was immediate and dramatic, with at least 3 sets of parents frantically covering their children's ears and rushing toward the exits with expressions that witnesses described as abject horror. The sight of families fleeing the venue while Folk Uke continued their performance with straight faces became one of the most talked-about moments in the festival's history. Despite the shocking nature of their material, Folk Uke has built a dedicated following and earned praise from unlikely sources, including celebrities who appreciate their fearless approach to comedy and music. They have released multiple albums and toured internationally, proving that there is an audience for their unique brand of musical provocation. Kathy's transformation from reluctant family member to provocative performer represents the most dramatic evolution of any of Arlo Guthrie's children, showing how even the most traditional musical families can produce artists who completely reject conventional expectations while still honoring the spirit of artistic rebellion that has always been part of the Guthrie legacy.